Welcome back. This is week 3, lecture 2, with the title, if I can remember, Pastoral Theology, Catechesis, and Religion in the Later Middle Ages, or Late Medieval Religion, or something close to that issue. This is then a lecture that comes out of the previous lecture. It's kind of a natural transition because I had talked about Jordan of Quedlinburg in terms of the Augustinian Renaissance and the creation, even though I don't think I use this term, but the creation of Augustinian identity, meaning the order of hermits of St. Augustine began to identify themselves as the true heirs of their leader, father, teacher, and head, Augustine of Hippo. And Augustine was a bishop, and a bishop is a pastor, at least theoretically, and Augustine certainly was. He preached extensively in Hippo, as well as writing theological works and dealing with church policies of church law and cases and all those other types of things that a bishop had to do in the early 5th century, late 4th, early 5th century, and on throughout medieval Christendom, basically, in many ways. Not that everyone fulfilled the office of bishop very well, necessarily, and that was one of the problems. I referred to the prince bishops and how bishops often didn't really fulfill their office as a spiritual office. Augustine did. But even as such, a bishop still was an administrator and a judge. And those were aspects of the duties of a bishop that did continue. And the only question was then how well did bishops fulfill those duties, either themselves or through people that they appointed to perform those duties for them in many ways. But we'll be getting to those things as well. But there is a distinction to be made between theology and what theologians in the universities and the theological schools uh, would be teaching, advocating, and then what was being preached to the people. Now, in some ways, that is still the case today, at least within the Christian tradition. Um, there are theology programs in academic universities. This in this country, we think of Harvard, we think of Chicago, we think of Yale, we think of Duke as some of the major ones. Um, and in Europe, most European universities have or had a department of theology. It's an academic discipline. But that distinction is different from becoming a pastor and actually dealing with people. And so pastoral theology is actually the reflection on how do we go about making this bridge between the theology of our tradition and what is being preached and taught about our tradition. There can be real gaps between the theological understanding and then the pastoral um, endeavor to reach the people. And then the further gap between what is actually being preached and taught and what people actually understand from that. So it is a real problem, theologically, religiously, pastorally, that is still with Christianity today. And even though I can't say that I've studied some of the other religious traditions, I'm assuming that's the case there as well. Certainly know, with Judaism, the rabbis, and then the people learn from the rabbis. But then, where's that gap, etc.? We have very high trained theological education. So it is a problem, and it was a problem throughout medieval Christendom and in the later Middle Ages as well, going on into the Reformation, as we will see. Because one of the questions that we'll be dealing with is, again, the success or failure, quote unquote, of the Reformation, both of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. If you look ahead, that's one of the questions for discussion is, did it fail? We read my book, I basically argue that it failed. The Reformation of the later Middle Ages was a failure. But then, two, there's the thesis that has been put out that the Reformation of the 16th century, of Luther's Reformation, failed. I'll be talking more about that as we go along. But that is pointing to this gap between the ideal and what was intended and hoped for, and then the reality of what actually came about, the level of understanding that people had. So I'm not going to go into all those issues, but this gap between the theological understanding and the um, general popular understanding is huge and was a problem, and we'll see that again and again and again. And that's why I'm focusing on this issue here now, and focusing on one of these Augustinian hermits, Jordan of Quedlinburg, whom I've done a lot of work on. And your reading for this week, as I think I mentioned last lecture, is Jordan's exposition of the Lord's Prayer. And that is posted. And it is posted as the proofs, final proofs for my book, which is the edition and translation of Jordan's exposition of the Lord's Prayer. And just to say, there we go. You can see it there. Isn't it next to that placard is not Jordan's. It's actually a 15th century table of the Lord's Prayer that was influenced by Jordan, but that's another issue. Now, why am I doing this? Well, number one, because Jordan's exposition of the Lord's Prayer was far more influential than scholars had previously ever known or realized. And the Augustinians were more influential and important for the religious and intellectual life of the later Middle Ages than previously known. So I think it's important to, let's say, give them a voice that they had at the time that has been basically erased by scholars who've been caught up in the confessional arguments over Luther and the Reformation, and on we go from there. Now, that being said, it's also important because Luther wrote and preached on the Lord's Prayer, and it's part of the Catechism. Part of the assignment is not only the English translation of Jordan's lectures, or Jordan's text, but I'll get to that in a moment, but also the introduction that I write, which goes through brief biography of Jordan, who he was, but in context, talks a bit about religion in the later Middle Ages, about the Lord's Prayer in the later Middle Ages. So that introduction, I think, is really important. And then it goes into some of the textual analysis of the text itself. That part of it you don't have to really know that much about. I mean, I'm going to be talking about the textual traditions later today, and I hope you'll listen to this lecture on the problems with the text. To be aware of it, because you're going to be analyzing this text. So you need to be aware of, how did it get into the form that you are going to be analyzing. That will allow you to answer the question that is given to you for your text analysis, with putting it in context as well. But you're certainly welcome to go into all the detail if you would like. If you have questions about it, please just ask. If you have studied Latin, that could even be a help. If you haven't, don't worry, because Latin is not required, and that's one of the reasons why all the textual discussions are not required, because it's basically based on the Latin text and comparing Latin text and such. But that first part, which is kind of the contextual frame for Jordan's lectures, I think you should be aware of. And I'll be coming back to talk more about this when we get there, but I'm going to then begin by stepping back and looking at the pastoral endeavor within Christendom as such. Because I believe I mentioned that in the early Middle Ages, being a Christian within the context of Christendom simply meant that you were baptized and attended Christian worship. And I think I believe I mentioned that if you want a fantastic read Gregory of Tours' History of the Franks, who were very violent people, and yet these were good, quote unquote, good Christians of the 6th and 7th centuries. Now, John Van Ingen's article, which I believe I mentioned on the Christianization of Europe, argued that by approximately the year 1000, all of Europe was Christian except for the Jews. But what did being Christian mean at that time? It still meant being baptized and going to Christian worship. And it's only beginning in the 11th and on into the 12th century that Europeans kind of began to ask themselves, okay, now what? We're Christian, but how do we really teach people how to be Christian? What does that really mean? How do we get into that content? And it's that approach that really begins in the long 12th century, as it's called, from the latter part of the 11th century on into the earlier part of the 13th century, this long part of the 12th century, which has been seen as a period of Renaissance. I think I mentioned Charles Homer Haskins. If I didn't, my apologies. I should add about Charles Homer Haskins' great work in the Renaissance of the 12th century. But then Giles Constable, a great medievalist, last generation basically, in the 1990s, I think it was, published a book called The Reformation of the 12th Century, a direct echo of Haskin's work. That really hasn't caught on, but it's really important because what Constable argued was that this new pastoral endeavor and approach was as much of a fundamental shift and reformation of what had come before than the 16th century or than the fourth century with the Christianization in Rome and all that. It's really this important period. So I just want to look briefly at this then development of the pastoral theology and the pastoral endeavor of the 12th century Renaissance or Reformation, depending on how we term it. And they have there the Christianization process and the religionization process. Now that is the term religionization is the term that I have coined, and I've coined it to refer to the process by which we make people Christian. The Christianization process that Van Engen and so many other people have talked about is the process of just converting and based on baptism and attending Mass, attending Christian worship. And then later developed, we'll talk about this later in the course a fair amount, the theory or the thesis of confessionalization. In the 16th century, there began a period of confessionalization. And there was, and we'll be talking about that too. But my then point is there's a process called religionization that I've termed religionization. And that's based on the term of religion and what is religion. And scholars in general, and Jordan does this too, but he's not the only one by any means, defined religion as that which binds us to God. I think I already mentioned that Cicero had defined religion as a civic virtue. Everybody had to be religious or pious in the Roman sense of pious, pious, long before Christianity ever came about. But those terms became very much Christian terms. And to be religious, in the Christian terms from the 12th century on, meant technically in a legal sense was actually entering religion. The state of being a religious, which meant the monastic state. One was a religious if one was in statu religionis, in the legal state of being a religious. We can't equate Christianity with being a religious. Thomas Aquinas, in the mid to second half of the 13th century, he asked the question explicitly, is Christianity a religion? Or is there only one religion within Christianity? He says, absolutely not. There are many religions within Christianity. Every monastic order is its own religion. It is how you go about fulfilling your obligations to God. But you don't have to join a monastic order to fulfill your religious obligations to God. You can take a private vow. You can do it your own way. But the idea began to be, okay, everybody should be religious. It's not just being Christian in name, not just being baptized and going to Mass, but what does it really mean to live a Christian life? That was this new endeavor that seeks to transform the hearts and souls as well as the minds of medieval Christendom. And there were three orders that particularly were put to work in this endeavor, and there were the new monastic orders, the Cistercians, the Premonstratensians, the Augustinian canons. I'm not going to go into all of those, but the Cistercians was a reform of Cluny. I think I mentioned the Cluniac monasticism in the basic structures of Christendom lecture. The Premonstratensians were technically Augustinian canons, but they became kind of an order on their own. And their whole point of these new monastic orders was to preach to the people, to reach the people, and to transform the hearts and minds of the people. Because that was this pastoral endeavor that really gets going, how to make people religious. That's why I talk about this religionization process. And it could be a general pastoral theological endeavor, or it could be if you are a member of a religious order, if you are a religious in that technical sense, how do we go about living that life? How do we, if I'm a member of the Augustinian Hermits, what does it mean to be a member of the Augustinian Hermits? How do I live? Now, every monastic order has rules and constitutions that seek to address those questions. But there's still questions that are left open. And I think I mentioned Jordan's Liber Vitas Frastrum, um, which was to answer just that. It was to answer the question of what does it mean to be an Augustinian hermit and to really follow Augustine. That's then on this micro level, as I referred to it, the emergence of micro religions within the religion of Christianity, which is actually more properly termed, at least in the terminology at the time, as a faith, not a religion. But within Christianity, we have various religions, and they're all groups. Well, except they can be hermits. That gets to be kind of messy and another issue. But and so it's how do you fulfill your responsibilities to God? How do you live a Christian life? There's not simply one way of doing it. There are multiple ways of doing it. Not everybody has to be a monk or a priest. That is what this process of making people religious was all about. And it begins in the 12th century, but then when the mendicants come along in the 13th centuries, I think I talked about the mendicants at some point in the past lectures, the Franciscans, Augustinians, and Dominicans, or I should say the Franciscans, Dominicans, and the Augustinian hermits, they too were explicitly directed by the Pope to go into the city, to win souls, to teach, and to preach. And they were far more highly educated than was the parish clergy. And I talked about some of the tensions between the parish clergy and the mendicant or the regular clergy, i.e., priests who were members of religious orders, the regular from the regula order. And it caused a lot of clerical anti-clericalism and tension that really contributed to the crisis. All of a sudden, it's like there's competing issues of the priesthood and people telling us what we should do, and then also it's not working. And I also brought up the plague issue and the thing they're not doing their jobs. Now that's the context. And the mendicants were explicitly sent into the cities to preach and to teach, to win souls for God. And that then brings us to the catechesis and teaching the people. How do we go about teaching the people? It's one thing to say we should do that, we need to do that, make them religious, but how do you go about it? Now, preaching was a big part of it. In Greek, the term for instruction is catechesis. That often was just taken over in Latin. And there were a number of catechetical works written. Augustine himself wrote a work on teaching the unlearned, on instructing the unlearned, the Catechizandis Rudibus, with Rudibus or the Rudes being the uneducated. How do you go about doing it? Because you can't sit and try to teach common people what it means to be a Christian, live a Christian life in the same way as you teach theology to your fellow friars or monks or seculars in the university. They're not going to get it. They don't have the background. So how do you go about doing it? There was no such thing as the catechism. That's why how I start out book chapter 1 of I believe I start out that way. Luther and the Reformation in the Middle Ages, chapter 1, or maybe it's a subsection thereof, or maybe it was in the introduction to Jordan's exposition, which is in a series of works I'm working on editing and translating of Jordan, with the overall title of this series of works as Catechesis in the Later Middle Ages. So there was no catechism in the Later Middle Ages. The catechism, and we'll be talking about this coming up in a number of lectures in the future, was a development of Luther. He wrote the first catechism as a distinct genre, and he did so for the same purposes. What do people need to know? And then finally, the Catholics came on board. There was the Roman Catechism, another number of other catechisms were written. But Luther begins this new genre. And it is a new genre because in Jordan's day, in the 14th century, there was no such thing, no one single work that was like, this is what you need to know if you're going to be a Christian. There were numerous works. There were certainly sermons. There were spiritual works. There were exhortations. There were a lot of catechetical works whose entire purpose was to instruct and to teach people what it meant to be a Christian. But there was no single one book or document that put everything together. Now, some of the basic things that became standard that Christians had to know, that every Christian had to know, and were then required for salvation, was that Christians had to know the creed. Now, that's part of Mass. Every Mass, you have to be able to say the creed. So you should be able to say the creed and sort of know what it means as well. You need to be able to know the responses in Mass. It's important. It's not necessarily absolutely necessary for salvation, but it is important. You need to know the Lord's Prayer, the Pater Noster. You need to know the Ave Maria, Hail Mary. Those are some, and you need to know the Ten Commandments. Those are like the four basic texts you need to know: the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, and the Ten Commandments. Certainly there were sermons on these things, but no one had brought it all together. So there was certainly a catechetical endeavor, and there was certainly a catechetical process and an attempt, but there was no formalized catechism and the teaching of the catechism until we get to the 16th century in Luther, and we'll be talking about that when we get there. You'll be reading Luther's Small Catechism, just as you're reading now Jordan's exposition of the Lord's Prayer. That's what this was all about, attempting to teach the people part of what they needed to know, because you need to know a certain amount of theological understanding for salvation. You actually do. Giles of Rome had already argued in the beginning of his treatise on ecclesiastical power that ignorance isn't going to cut it. Christians need to know what is required. Let's say the bare minimum, what is required for salvation, or otherwise they're going to miss it. You can't simply say, I was never taught. We need to teach people. And in some ways, that's what Giles was trying to do with his treatise on ecclesiastical power. He says, I want to write and say, what do Christians need to know about the institutional power of the papacy and of the church as an institution for salvation? What can you say no to? What do you have to follow along? And all those kinds of questions and issues. That is part of this more general approach of catechesis, and that is what Jordan was doing too. Now, if we then skip ahead to his lectures themselves, and start looking at that, we see too he's addressing a couple of different aspects. He's addressing belief, he's addressing different levels of belief, and trying to guide, let's say, a natural, popular religious understanding along the lines that are in keeping with the theological perspective of the Augustinian hermits and of the institutional church at large. And I have up here, before getting more precisely to Jordan, the slide Religion, Belief, and Theology, because there are distinctions that should be made. Religion is a practical issue, is what we do. Belief is what we believe, and theology is an academic discipline. And there's a distinction between popular religion and official religion. Now, there is not necessarily two completely separate worlds, but the religious life and understanding of the common people, and here I'm not talking about the peasantry as such, I'm just talking about the non-theologically trained people, the common people in society, from wealthy to poor, is very different from the understanding that is being taught in the universities and attempted to be taught to the people. It's that gap that I mentioned to begin with. It's the popular religion and the official religion. Now, every theologian, every academic theologian, every preacher, every pastor, every pope, and everything else had begun as within the realm of popular religion. So there is an issue that they know what popular religion is, even though they're eventually within the realm of official religion, if that makes sense. If you want to say, religion of the people as distinct from academic theology, that's fine too, and that gap that is there. But if you don't become an official theologian, if you're just part of the general populace, popular religion is basically all you have. And so there can be conflicts, and we see that today too. Um, Conflicts between a popular understanding of what is acceptable Christian practice as distinct from the official theological position of it. And it can cause a lot of conflict. And it's still with us today. And it was there at the time too. So the idea is, how do we shape and form popular religion to be more in keeping with official religion, the official positions of the church? Even then for Jordan's case and the other Augustinian hermits, as seen through the eyes of the Augustinian hermits. Now, I'll be talking later, I think next week or so, about the endeavor to teach parish priests, because I think I mentioned that the parish priests in general were not well educated, whereas the mendicant priests were. And there began to be this kind of two-tiered approach to catechesis and teaching the people. One was to the people at large directly, and the other was by means of, we need to teach the priests. I'll be talking about another Augustinian hermit of Schildesche in his handbook for the simple parish priest in another, again, week or so, I think. You will see there kind of what the level of the common parish priest actually was at the time. And it's pretty shockingly low, but we'll get there when we get there. Whereas the Mendicants are university trained theologians. So that's too is part of what Jordan was doing. And part of that too was his teaching to his fellow Augustinians, not so much at the university, but in the what's called the general school, or even the local or particular schools of the order. Because the order itself, the Augustinian hermits, had their own school system, as did the Franciscans and as did the Dominicans. It all culminated in the university. And Giles of Rome, the Augustinian hermit who wrote on ecclesiastical power, etc., and I've talked about in terms of Philip IV, he was the first chair of theology at the University of Paris for the Augustinians. I'm not going to go into all the details of the educational system and how it relates to the universities, but it is important. You study at the universities, but there were also these other schools, general schools of the order, where you could go to study if you were an Augustinian hermit. If you wanted to be a preacher, or if you wanted to go teach at a local cloister, you needed to go to these more general schools, and first the local schools, and that was distinct from going to the university. It was still academic. And in Erfurt, there was a general school, a Studium Generale, that eventually became part of the University of Erfurt, which was not established until the later 14th century, about 392, I think the foundation date of the University of Erfurt is. But before the University of Erfurt was established, there's the Studium Generale of the Augustinians in Erfurt. And we have a number of very influential and well-educated Augustinians teaching in Erfurt. Jordan of Quedlinburg was one. Herman of Schildesche, whom I just mentioned, had taught there for a bit. Henry of Freimar taught there for quite a long time. He had been trained at Paris, and Jordan had been trained at Paris. So they had the highest level of theological training. And yet they're teaching in a general school of the order, some members of whom would be studying there would hope to go on to the university if the order deemed it appropriate, whereas others might not. So Jordan is teaching within the theological faculty of the general school in Erfurt for the Augustinians. And he's lecturing on the Gospel of Matthew. When you look at the text, you'll see it's divided into different lectures, 10 different lectures. Those are lectures. They became sermons. I'll be talking about that shortly. So the whole point is that Jordan was trying to then teach the preachers who would be going out and teaching the common people, because there was a lot of confusion, and we could still say there, in some ways there still is, between what is valid, viable religious belief and what is superstition. I have there too under ritual and practice, because ritual is just what you do. You can go to mass every Sunday. You can go to mass, 5 times a week, just without really thinking much about it or believing much, even though you're practicing the ritual, the liturgy, and that is very important. But how do we get beyond that mere ritualistic approach to living a Christian life? What goes on at Mass is, or can be seen as, or experienced as, miraculous and spiritual. I'm not going to go into all that here and now. We'll be talking a little bit more about that, but especially with respect to the Eucharist, because the Eucharist, the bread and the wine, the laity, the common people, only could partake of the bread. They were not given the cup, the wine, and they rarely ever received communion. They rarely ever received the elements of the bread and the wine. The priest, the officiating priest, always did. Maybe they would at Easter, maybe they would at Christmas. Once or twice a year, they would receive communion, receive the host, as it was said. So they certainly would. Now, if you're a noble, it was far more common, if you're a king or a prince, that you would actually go in and receive communion at every mass. But for the common people, it was different. But what happens is that at the words of institution, when they get to that part of the mass to celebrate the Eucharist, and they hold up the body, they talk about the Last Supper, and with Jesus and his disciples. And Jesus took the bread, blessed it, broke it, and said, "This is my body given for you." And in the Mass, that's when the host that represents, or was the bread, and is bread, was held up and elevated with the words "Hoc est corpus meum," "This is my body." And the bell would ring, ding-a-ling-a-ling. And at that point, the priest was holding not a piece of bread, but the body of Christ. It had been transubstantiated into the literal physical body of Christ under the accidents of bread. So it still looked like bread, it still tastes like bread, it still smelled like bread, but the substance had been transformed. Now, this was based on Aristotelian physics, actually, because Aristotle argued that everything that is can be analyzed according to its substance and its accidents. That there is a substance that is Professor Eric Sock. Just even leave off the title because that's an accident. There is a substance that is me, or that I am. And then there's all the accidents. What I'm wearing is an accident. My new glasses are an accident. Whether or not I've shaved is an accident. Whether or not I've gained 20 pounds or lost 20 pounds or whatever is an accident. My substance doesn't change. The accidents do change. There had been a lot of discussion and debate over what goes on in the Mass at that point of elevation when the bells go ding-a-ling-a-ling. What goes on? What is happening from very early on? It's like the central mystery of Christian religion, the Mass. It was only secured and defined definitively at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Based on Aristotelian physics, when it was determined that what happens in the Eucharist, and in the unique case of the Eucharist, at the words of institution, when the little bell rings, ding-a-ling-a-ling, the elements of bread and wine are transubstantiated into the body and blood of Christ. So that the accidents stay the same, but the substance changes. Whereas in every other case of being, individual things, accidents change all the time, the substance never changes. Here, in this one case, the substance changes, not the accidents. And we'll be talking a lot about this later. It was magical. Priest says words, and there's a transformation of these elements. The emperor himself could not make that work. The emperor himself could go in, say mass, and say Hoc ex corpus meum with all pure intent, and nothing would happen because you have to be an ordained priest. There is this magical quality to it. And certainly as it was received by the general populace, it was a magical quality to it. And everyone wanted to see this transformation. That was the whole focus, was on seeing what was going on and watching as the elevated host and as the elevated chalice was transformed into, transubstantiated into the actual physical body and blood of Christ. And it was powerful. That's where we get these host miracles and stories of people, common people, going up to receive communion, but not then ingesting the bread, but kind of going back and keeping it and then giving it to their horse or planting it in their fields, thinking if this is going to be so efficacious, it can certainly heal my horse, or can certainly bring about a very fecund harvest. That's the kind of quote-unquote superstition that then passes into the magical. In some ways, we can say superstition is just that. It is taking the mysterious and the mystery and seeing it as magic. Mystery is mystery. But when we start seeing mystery as magic, that is where the superstition comes in. And that is what is going on. And with the Lord's Prayer, it too could be seen almost as a magical formula, because it was so efficacious, just praying the Lord's Prayer. That too, Jordan addressed. And as we'll see shortly, Jordan 2 focused on visual images, creating visual images, at least in the minds of the people reading his text, of listening to his lectures. But we'll get there momentarily, because Jordan created a whole new technology of knowledge, information, or almost information technology, I've argued. And his exposition on the Lord's Prayer is a major part of that. So that's what's going on in terms of this attempt to shape and guide, let's say, the natural superstitious stance of human beings into the mysterious and or an intellectual understanding of what was going on, rather than a magical or superstitious or magical understanding of what's going on. How do we go about doing this? That was the issue. And no Christian theologian could ever deny the existence of miracles, because what is the Mass? It's a miracle. What is the resurrection? It's a miracle. Crucifying somebody is just crucifying somebody, but that somebody rose from the dead, that is miraculous. That is God working here on earth within time, within our world. The burning bush for Moses was miraculous. Any time that God directly intervenes within time is a miracle. How do we understand it? How do we deal with it? So that's what it's all about. Now, that is the broader picture. What I want to do now is turn directly to Jordan's text, to his exposition on the Lord's Prayer, to look at some of the strategies he used to try to teach his students. That's what he's doing. Keep in mind, he is lecturing just like I'm lecturing to you right now, but not just like it, because he didn't do it over a video. He didn't offer an online course, of course. He's in a classroom teaching. and teaching these students. These students are wanting to be ordained. Maybe they already are ordained, but they want to have better understanding so they can go out and preach effectively to win souls for God and to proclaim the gospel and the truth and to have people understand it correctly. That was the goal and the mission. And in Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount is where we find the Lord's Prayer. And when Jordan got to that part of the text to lecture on the Gospel of Matthew, the students thought it was so important and that he did such a great job. They said, Brother Jordan, would you be willing to publish your lectures separately so that we basically can use them? Write them up, let us give us a copy or let us make a copy so we can take us with us when we go out to preach and teach. And Jordan did that. So that is kind of the setting of what's going on. So it's all about reaching minds and souls of Jordan's own students, and then the congregations, the audience of those students as they went out to preach. So here we have Jordan of Quedlinburg's exposition of the Lord's Prayer, which, of course, again, is the focus of your first textual analysis. Now, who was Jordan? Now, I talk about Jordan in the introduction. Augustinian hermit, had joined the order. He probably was born around 1299. We're not for sure exactly when. Joined the order probably around 14, 15 years old. So right as the famine is about to hit, and he joined in Quedlinburg, which is a city in was in Saxony today. It's in eastern part of Germany. What used to be East Germany, kind of between Erfurt and Magdeburg. It's a beautiful little city. I've been there, and it's great. And he probably joined the Augustinian cloister because there was an Augustinian cloister in Quedlinburg. Is where he probably joined. We don't know anything about his family. So that's why he's just called Jordan of Quedlinburg. He's also referred to as Jordan of Saxony. Now, if you Google Jordan of Saxony, you're probably going to first get entries for a Dominican who also was known as Jordan of Saxony. So it's a real problem. And that's why the Dominicans and Franciscans get all the press. My Jordan doesn't. That's why I kind of always try to be consistent in referring to him as Jordan of Quedlinburg rather than Jordan of Saxony, even though it's in the sources we find both names, Jordanus de Saxonia or Jordanus de Quedlinburg. We don't know much about him. We know he first was sent to Pavia to study, and then he was sent to Paris to study. And he received finally his degree of lector from Paris, which was not a university degree. It was a degree within the order. Jordan studied at the order's general school in Paris, but not at the University of Paris. I think it's very institutionally complex. You can wrap your mind around IUPUI. Now, of course, now we're breaking that up too, so we have to wrap our minds around something very new. But it's kind of difficult to say what are we? We're Purdue and IU, and how does that all work? That's a little bit. You should be able to understand the distinction, the relationship between the various mendicant orders, general schools, and then a university. But that's not the real focus here that I'm going to spend extra time on. So Jordan studied in Paris at the general school, by which time the Augustinians did have a chair of theology in Paris, but Jordan never technically matriculated in the University of Paris. This General School of Paris, though, was the most important general school of the order, because if you were studying at the University of Paris and you were an Augustinian hermit, you were also part of that general school, studying at the general school, but just attached to the regent master to be promoted. To go up for promotion, or what we say was graduation, to receive your degree, your bachelor's degree of theology. We know, though, that the required education was pretty extensive. I'll be talking more about that later, also comparing it with later times. I'll write about it in my Luther book, which you'll be able to read and see the almost shocking and surprising decline of academic standards going into the 15th century, the post-schism 15th century, which I'll begin talking about the schism coming up after this period of crisis and the Black Death and the famine and war and poverty and everything else. Something else very cataclysmic came about. We will talk about that when we get there. So Jordan's in this context. He also then had to spend some time teaching. We're not sure if it was in Erfurt first or somewhere else, but then he came back, finished his degree, and then we find him in Erfurt from 1322 on. So he's fairly young. He was 23, 24, 25 years old. He'd been living as an Augustinian friar for at least a decade, most likely. He begins teaching, and Henry of Freemar, who's much older, was older than Jordan was, took Jordan under his wing, and Henry had been a regent master of theology at Paris, and was very much in the swing of the University of Paris and the theological conditions at Paris, and on we go. But Jordan was of a kind of a lower-ish level. Now, Jordan starts lecturing on the Gospel of Matthew. And that's really what this is about. Now, I have up there the problems of the text or lectures or sermons. Are they both? Because they are both. Because once Jordan's students asked him to write up an independent treatise, he does. And we have manuscripts of Jordan's exposition circulating as lectures, as Jordan's exposition on the Lord's Prayer. But then later in life, in the course of the 1340s, 50s, 60s, 70s, Jordan dies approximately 1380. He wrote a number of collections of sermons called model sermon collections. His first one being his most widespread and well-known, actually not his most widespread, but his most widely known, the Opus Postularum. Then he wrote a series of sermons on the saints, the Opus Dan, which was, preaching on the saints. And that was the most widely spread, at least in manuscripts. The Opus Postularum, the Postil, you will hear that term later because Luther wrote apostles, the Christmas apostles, so which is basically just another type of sermon, let's say. Model sermon, in essence. And he also wrote another series of sermons. And the Opus Postularum, and it became known as the Opus Ior. So he wrote the Opus Ior and the Opus Dan. Dan, yes, it's fun, fascinating stuff. Was organized according to the liturgical year. From Advent through, Pentecost. And so that was, they were called Sermones de Tempore, or sermons according to the time of the church year, the calendar year. And then he has this thing of the saints. When he wrote his Opus Postularum, which consists of 460 sermons, by the way, he included his 10 lectures on the Lord's Prayer as sermons 289 to sermons 298. So they became sermons, and they circulated as sermons as well as an independent treatise on the Lord's Prayer. So are they sermons? Are they lectures? What are they? And they're both. And they need to be read as both. When you read them, you might ask yourself, okay, how effective would this be as a sermon? And probably it's like, probably not all that effective as a sermon. It could be. But Jordan also wrote a treatise that was his most widely spread treatise and very influential, the Meditations on the Passion of Christ. That also circulated separately as Meditationes de Passione Christi. But then he, too, included those sermons within his Opus Postularum, 65 sermons, because there were 65 articles of the Passion, and I'll be talking about that later, I think, as well. Now, what do we make of all this? When you are reading this, I want you to think and ask yourself, what is Jordan trying to get at? What is he trying to say? Now, your text analysis assignment, which I have right there for you. Oh, I didn't I thought I had called it up for myself, and I didn't. Um, but it is saying, okay, in my book, and I'm talking about Jordan, and I give the page reference. I said, for Jordan, theologically, and here I'm talking about and analyzing and basing my analysis on not only his exposition of the Lord's Prayer, but also his other sermons, as you will read in there about it. Um, he knew that we were predestined sons of God. He knew that we had God's grace. Well, see, Luther, supposedly the question that he was seeking is, how do I find a righteous and merciful God? A merciful God. Jordan already knew. And Jordan already knew that living the Christian life was this battle between God and the devil. So, given that, and given that we are the adopted sons of God, that we are the part of the predestined, how do we live? That question is my question. Jordan doesn't ever pose that explicitly. Jordan doesn't say, now I need to ask, how do we live? Or the so what question. But Jordan gives the answer without asking the question. On the basis of your analysis of the text of his exposition of the Lord's Prayer, how would Jordan have answered that question if we had posed that question directly to him at the time? If we had said, Brother Jordan, now what? How do we live? His exposition on the Lord's Prayer is an answer, and a very, I think, important answer, and it became a very influential answer. Now, I already talked about it, that he's not writing an academic, scholarly biblical commentary, because he's trying to address future preachers who'd be preaching to the people and teaching the people. So if we say that there's, let's say, three levels, there's the academic theological level, there's the level of teaching future priests and pastors, and those can be the same. I mean, in that they can, future pastors can also be the academic theology. And then there's the common preacher who's preaching to the people. So what level are we getting at? But yet, Jordan also intended his exposition to be useful either directly or as the basis for preachers composing sermons to give to the people and to teach the people, because he adds a second exposition at the end. In the 10th lecture, not only is it on the Amen and what does the term Amen mean, he also then says, to make the Paternoster become the meaning of the Paternoster more clear for everybody, I'm going to summarize all my lectures around the image of a tree. He creates a visual image. It's a mnemonic device, but it's also tapping into that increased focus on the visual in late medieval culture, the elevation of the Eucharist, the beginnings of artistic development and the portrait and things. And also, too, he did something like this too in his separate work of his that he included in a collection he put together called the Collectanea Sancti Augustini, or the a collection of Augustinian texts, several of which are by Jordan himself. These are also where the sermons to his brothers in the Hermitage are found, Jordan's sermons. It's called the Metrum pro dependenda vita Sancti Augustini. Verses for depicting the life of St. Augustine. He created an iconographic program. Now, Jordan also wrote a biography of Augustine in his Collectanea, Vita Sancti Augustini, a life of Augustine. He wrote one, a kind of a traditional one, but did completely new things with it, and really tried to bring out that what I call the myth of Augustine, the new Hermetical Augustine as the father of the hermits. That was the new biography that Jordan wrote about it. But then he also said, if we want to depict Augustine in pictures and paintings or in stained glass, here's how you can go. Here's a scheme to follow. And then there are verses, which are mnemonic devices, poetry, to go with the images. He does not paint the images himself, and we've found no evidence that anybody has actually done it, but then exactly as Jordan prescribed or suggested, but there are certainly became in the early 15th century a couple of cycles called cycles of Augustine's life that are iconographic, that are pictures, and some have then two verses, and there are some parallels, and so his treatise had a major impact. We've also never found a, a iconographic depiction of the tree of the Lord's Prayer that Jordan describes. He's creating it for us to imagine, because an imagined image in our mind had the same effect as a real image that we're looking at. And that vision, the eyes were the windows to the soul. And Jordan and other sermons talks about this. The images from the external world enter our souls through our eyes. He says why we need to keep guard on our eyes. Otherwise, dangerous images can come in. That imagery, even if we close our eyes, we still have our minds. So if we're imagining all kinds of perverted, evil images, that's going to affect our soul. So we need to think in our mind about the Lord's Prayer and how can we visualize it? How can we visualize it? And that's what Jordan was constructing. And he was doing so as a new means of information technology, of knowledge management, that in some ways we could say led to our PowerPoint and some of the issues today. That's maybe going a bit too far, but the whole point was this is a new departure. There had never been something like this before. With Jordan's Matrum, and then with his exposition on the Lord's Prayer, probably done more or less at the same time. There had been stained glass, and the Erfurt, St. Peter's in Erfurt, had a series of stained glass panels depicting the life of Augustine. But so he may have gotten the idea from that, because he's looking at it whenever he goes into St. Peter's in Erfurt. But he does something different with it, and he puts it in textual form as a programmatic visualization and concretization of a discursive text, the Lord's Prayer. Discursive meaning something to be spoken, even if silently. When you say the Lord's Prayer to yourself, you still are saying the words. But Jordan says, no, we need to see the images to understand the power of this prayer. And that's what's called the Expositio Arboris, the exposition of the tree of the Lord's Prayer. And I talk more about that too in the introduction to the text, which I hope you'll read. So that is what is going on and why this text is so important. It's not only important to help us understand Jordan, it is important for understanding the religious life of the later Middle Ages. It's not just the Franciscans and the Dominicans, the Augustinian contribution, and Jordan made a massive contribution to the Augustinian contribution of the Augustinians to the religious understanding of the later Middle Ages, which is prerequisite for understanding what happened as we get into the 16th century. And the whole point was to transform lives and to save souls. This is the catechetical endeavor that I mentioned and started with. It is an attempt to teach people, to reach people, to save souls for Christ before the catechism, because the catechism hadn't been developed yet, but there was catechesis. There was catechesis, and how do we go about transforming people's lives? Because for Jordan, every Christian not only should be religious, but indeed, every Christian should be a saint. Every Christian should be a saint. That's what the Christian life means. It means to be holy. It means to be set apart. That's what holy means. That's what sanctus sanctum means, is someone who is set apart. Christians are called to be set apart. This too would have importance in terms of Luther's understanding of the so-called priesthood of all believers. Jordan is not arguing for the priesthood of all believers, but he's certainly arguing that every individual Christian should be a saint. And every individual Christian needs to be a saint because they find themselves in this world, in this Christian life, in this vale of tears, as he says, in a constant battle between God and the devil. The devil is always trying to pull our souls and win souls for the devil, and the demons are trying to win souls for the devil. Temptations are out there, whereas Jesus and God, and that's where on side we're on, trying to win souls for God. And we can talk about the metaphysical and theological aspect of it. Is this not a dualistic or a dualism? It's like, yeah, in some ways it is, but this is getting at people's experienced realities. We need to make sure that we are successful in the battle against the devil. It's a constant battle. As Christian life, as we seek to find our way back home, as Augustine would say, with God. Now, I'll talk more about that in the book. That's the endeavor and the urgency and need for doing so. Was this crisis that people found themselves in. This is a real upsurge in this catechetical endeavor that is qualitatively and quantitatively distinct from what had been going on in the 12th century, 13th century. There's a new dynamic and a new urgency and a new endeavor to reach as many people as possible, to win souls for God, because the end is coming and we're fighting the devil. We don't want to be dragged off into hell, so we have to fight. How do we go about doing so? That's the question that you have to answer based on Jordan's text. For Jordan, I'm not asking you as individuals to say, how do we fight the devil? There's a very easy answer you could give was, we don't. I don't believe in the devil. I don't believe in God. We don't fight the devil. And I'd have to accept that. So I'm not asking you for your personal opinion. What I'm asking you is to try to put yourself in the mind of Jordan based on your analysis of his text. And then the reading, the introduction, and then the readings in my Luther book and this lecture, to say, okay, if you're thinking that you're in the mind of Jordan and someone were to ask you, how do we live in this battle between God and the devil? How would you answer for Jordan? Whether you would answer that way for yourself is completely different. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, how would you respond for Jordan to the question, how do we live in Christian life in the context of this battle between God and the devil? How do we do it? And what does this text, his exposition of the Lord's Prayer, how does that serve to help us do that? And what is the evidence in the text to support your answer? If you have any questions, please just ask, send me an email. I'm happy to help. I hope you'll enjoy it, and I hope you'll actually enjoy the process of writing the text analysis. This is your first one. We'll go from there. And thank you for your patience. And I'll be back for the first lecture of week 4 before you know it. Anyway, thanks so much. Bye-bye.